October, Ichen Barbite Washaloop, the silence of the Alabama fields was not the silence of peace. It was the hush before a storm no man had recorded, but which the earth itself would never forget. On Hollow Creek Plantation, cotton glistened under the heavy sun, and the air smelled of sap, sweat, and smoke. But beneath that surface something waited. Stop. Locals, who still whispered the tale, claim it began with the dot. Overseers, 5 men whose cruelty had been sharpened into habit, their authority carried in whips and iron. On the night of October, sure earth, their reign ended. By dawn, their bodies were discovered, mutilated with sickles, their flesh scattered among the very fields they had forced others to harvest. Not a single suspect was ever taken, not a single enslaved worker ever spoke. Hollow Creek fell into silence, its gates closed, its records erased, and yet the land itself refused to forget. Y'all, the plantation had been one of the largest in Barbour County, sitting on the churning banks of the Chattahoochee River. 200 enslaved men and children worked the fields, while a handful of white families and overseers profited from their labor. The main house stood 2 stories tall, its shutters painted a fading green, its bricks already weathering, overlooking the endless cotton rows like a pale sentinel. To a traveler passing on the river road, it may have looked serene, even prosperous. But those who lived within its borders knew another story. Quite the head overseer, Enoch Merritt, was a man whose name lingered in local curses long after his death. He was precise, brutal, and inventive in his punishments. A man named Josiah, for example, was once confined in a dry well for the crime of lifting his eyes toward a white man. He was never seen again. These stories spread among the enslaved quarters like whispered prayers, turning fear into something denser, heavier, like the dark clouds that gather before lightning strikes. By the harvest season of Ichen Barbite Washaloop, Hollow Creek carried a tension that could not be ignored. The usual songs of the enslaved, low hymns and field chants that drifted like smoke over the cotton, had ceased. In their place, strange murmurs rose at dusk. Some claimed it was chanting, others said it was lamentation, but all agreed it was unsettling. Overseers responded with whips and threats, but the silence only deepened. The plantation's records, which once boasted steady yields and strict order, began to thin. From October to December, no agricultural logs exist, no tax reports filed, no production tallies. In the Barbour County archives, a single red ink notation sits beside Hollow Creek's name, operation suspended, incident under review. But no document explains, and yet the fragments of testimony that survived, diary pages, family letters, and whispered accounts, point to one night when the balance of power shifted in ways both human and inhuman. One account, from Sarah Alcott, a visiting relative of the plantation's owner, describes being woken by firelight outside her window. She saw Merritt stumbling in the dark, something behind him gleaming in the blaze. She could not describe it. The next morning, the barn lay in ashes, and the overseers were dead. Another account, from a traveling preacher, speaks of hearing a chorus of cries, not the cries of drunken fights or punishments, but something primal, as though the earth itself was wailing. These fragments are all that remain of the official story, but the land holds its own testimony. Generations after, locals refused to step foot where Hollow Creek once stood. Farmers who tried to reclaim the soil found their crops withered. Hunters said their dogs refused the brush. And every October, Churth crickets went silent at dusk, as though the earth was still listening. Hollow Creek's legacy was not written in ledgers or legal reports. It was whispered instead of a night when the cotton fields bled and the harvest took its reapers. The night of October, Juearth, Ichen Barbite Washaloop, remains one of the darkest entries in Barbour County folklore. The overseers of Hollow Creek had ruled for years with iron fists, their shadows long over the enslaved community. But on that night something broke. Whether it was rage, retribution, or a force far older than man, no one living ever confessed. What they left behind was carnage, accounts are fragmented. The plantation kept no official record, but whispers travelled downriver, carried in letters and tavern stories. They say it began in the cotton fields, just after sundown. Overseer Elias Holley was found slumped against a fence post, his throat cut with his own knife. His horse had bolted, and the lantern he carried was smashed on the earth, flames licking the dry weeds. By the time anyone reached him, it was too late. Moments later, two more overseers, John Tate and Matthew Rourke, were discovered in the quarters. Caught in Tate's skull was caved in with a field hammer. Rourke was pinned beneath a collapsed door, his body pierced by broken timber, as though something had crushed him. But it was the state of Enoch Merritt, the head overseer, that struck terror into the county. He was found at dawn near the barn, half burned and torn open, his eyes missing, his chest cavity marked with patterns. No doctor could explain. The enslaved community, numbering nearly 200, stood silent. When questioned by the militia, they spoke nothing. Not a word of rebellion, not a whisper of resistance. They stood as though bound by an oath of silence. Some historians suggest it was an uprising, that after years of cruelty, the enslaved workers seized their moment to the men who had terrorized them. Now, others argue the details, the precision, the ritualistic markings, the sheer terror recorded in the overseer's final expressions suggest something more. The diaries of Sarah Alcott shed further light. On the night of October, Earth, she wrote of hearing a sound she could not describe, like 100 voices speaking in a single breath. She described torches moving in unison through the fields, yet when she peered closer, the forms holding them seemed not entirely human. Their shapes blurred like smoke, and their faces were shrouded, she recorded. Yet they walked as men. Another letter, penned by a traveling preacher who arrived days later, spoke of standing near the barn ruins and feeling the earth tremble. He swore that the soil was warm beneath his boots, as though it still smoldered, though no fire had touched it in days. I heard wailing from the earth, he wrote, and I knew then the overseers had not died, as men should die. Whatever the truth, the militia responded swiftly. They marched on Hollow Creek with rifles and chains, rounding up dozens of enslaved workers. Many were beaten. Some were hung without trial, their bodies left along the river road as a warning. But even under threat of death, not one confessed to the killings. The massacre of the overseers became more than an incident. It became a void in history. The plantation shut its gates, the cotton withered, and Hollow Creek's name was struck from county records. But the story spread nonetheless, turning into fireside warnings and whispered curses. Parents told children never to wander too close to the ruins. Preachers warned their flocks that rebellion carried curses, and the enslaved descendants who remained in Alabama carried the silence with them for generations. But every October, when the nights grew heavy and the air turned thick, some swore they saw torches moving in the old fields of Hollow Creek, shadows walking where no one should walk. And in the stillness of that anniversary, the crickets fell silent, just as they had the night the overseers died. By the time autumn settled over Hollow Creek, the silence was no longer the only thing haunting the plantation. Whispers began to spread, not through voices, but through the uncanny feeling that someone or something was always listening. The militia tried to maintain order. Patrols circled the fields, lanterns in hand, searching for signs of rebellion. But at night, strange things unsettled even the most disciplined men. Lantern flames flickered and died without wind. Horses refused to walk past the oak grove near the quarters, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling. One soldier claimed he heard singing, not the sorrowful hymns once sung in the cabins, but something lower, older, a chant that rolled beneath the earth itself. Yet when he searched the cabins, not a mouth was moving. The people stood there, eyes lowered, faces blank, and the silence pressed down again, stronger than before. Captain Rourke, the militia leader, scoffed at such tales. He called his men superstitious, warned them against fear. Yet even he avoided the fields at night. He admitted once, in a rare moment of honesty, that the rows of corn seemed to shift under the moonlight, as if something moved unseen among the stalks. The overseers reported other disturbances, tools misplaced but never stolen, doors of storehouses found open, though no locks were broken, livestock that refused to enter pens after dusk, and always that suffocating silence. It was not just fear, it was anticipation, as if Hollow Creek itself waited for something to break. In all, the enslaved people carried on, but differently. Their movements were synchronized, their eyes steady, their silence a shared vow. Outsiders described it as if they were performing a ritual too vast for understanding. One farmer from a nearby county said, "They are waiting, but for what, I cannot say." One night in October, the first true sign appeared. A guard swore he saw figures standing in the yard at midnight. Not the living workers, but shapes, dark silhouettes with burning eyes that seemed to glow against the night sky. He fired his rifle, but no sound came from the shot. The gunpowder flared, the smoke rose, but the night remained silent. Not even the crack of the bullet echoed. The guard fled, abandoning his post, and refused to return. Rumors spread through the militia camp. Men whispered of ghosts, of old spirits bound to the land. Some believed the silence itself was alive, that it had grown into something that fed on fear. And perhaps they were right, for even the bravest officers found their tempers fraying, their sleep restless. Letters from Hollow Creek reached nearby towns, written by soldiers and overseers alike. They described dreams of shadowy figures standing over their beds, of waking to find strange symbols carved into wooden walls. Merchants stopped delivering goods. Preachers spoke in sermons of curses and divine judgment. By winter, Hollow Creek's reputation had changed entirely. No longer just a plantation, it was spoken of as a threshold between worlds. People said those who entered its fields after sundown did not always return, or if they did, they returned changed, silent, pale, unwilling to speak of what they had seen. The militia grew restless, yet still they stayed. Pride bound them to the land as much as orders did. To leave would be to admit fear had conquered them. And so they remained, trapped between their disbelief and their terror, waiting for something they could not name. The silence endured, the whispers continued, and Hollow Creek grew darker with every passing night. The chaos had ended, but the weight of what had happened lingered like a thick fog over the town. Streets once filled with the laughter of children and the bustle of daily life now felt hollow, the air heavy with whispers of fear and disbelief. The townspeople moved cautiously, their steps quieter, their conversations hushed. Even the sunlight seemed muted, filtering weakly through the clouds, as if reluctant to touch the earth below. Families of the victims were the first to truly feel the impact. Homes that had once been filled with warmth now echoed with silence. The empty chairs at dinner tables became cruel reminders of absence, while photographs and personal belongings of the lost seemed to hold the weight of untold stories. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, neighbors exchanged quiet glances of shared grief, and the town itself seemed to mourn collectively. The authorities, who had initially attempted to downplay the disaster, were now under scrutiny. Reports were collected, statements were taken, and investigations moved forward with painstaking precision. The mayor, a figure who had once exuded authority and calm, now appeared frail and worn, his public speeches weighed down by exhaustion and the burden of accountability. He walked the streets, listening to citizens, offering words of reassurance, though even he seemed unsure of how to heal the wounds that could not be seen, but were deeply felt. In the days following, small details began to emerge, fragments of moments that might have prevented the tragedy, or at least warned those involved. A door left ajar, a warning ignored. Fleeting shadows glimpsed too late. These became the haunting memories that lingered in the minds of survivors. Children returned to school and playgrounds, yet their laughter was tentative, cautious, shadowed by the memory of fear. Journalists flooded the town, their cameras and notebooks documenting every tear, every whispered recollection. Stories began to surface of heroism and bravery, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers offering comfort, acts of kindness that punctuated the grief. Local leaders organized vigils and community gatherings, reminding everyone that while the tragedy had left scars, human resilience and compassion. Yet, even with these efforts, the sense of vulnerability remained. A sudden noise or a gust of wind seemed to carry echoes of that day, pulling survivors back into the memory of terror. Dreams were restless, often replaying fragments of the incident in distorted, haunting ways. The psychological toll was invisible but omnipresent, affecting even those who had escaped physical harm. Counselors and therapists worked tirelessly with the townspeople, explaining that grief is not linear, but a complex web of emotion that includes sorrow, anger, guilt, and even relief. Each individual processed the trauma differently, some seeking to protect and rebuild, others left paralyzed by memories that refused to fade. Gradually, routines returned, small and fragile, shops reopened, streets were cleaned, and families resumed daily activities, though a quiet tension lingered beneath every action. Memorials were erected in honor of those lost, engraved with names and dates that would ensure they were never forgotten. Candles were lit, flowers laid, and silent prayers whispered. These gestures offered a semblance of closure, a collective recognition of both the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. Even as time passed, these memorials became a focal point for reflection, resilience, and remembrance. The story of that day became part of the town's collective memory, recounted not only for the tragedy itself, but also for the courage, compassion, and solidarity displayed in its aftermath. Lessons were learned, not only in the practical sense, but also in emotional awareness, an understanding of vulnerability, empathy, and the importance of community. While the shadows of that day would never fully disappear, the town had found in itself the ability to endure and adapt, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope could persist. Months passed, and the town slowly began to reclaim its rhythm. The raw edges of grief softened, though the memories remained vivid. People started returning to routines that had once seemed trivial. Shops reopened, children laughed more freely, and the clatter of daily life returned to the streets. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle shift had occurred. The tragedy had left an indelible mark, changing how the townspeople viewed one another, their homes, and the world around them. Those who had survived the incident found themselves carrying invisible burdens. Many took to documenting their experiences in journals, letters, or public statements, hoping that by sharing their stories, others could learn from the chaos they had endured. Conversations in the town now carried an undercurrent of awareness. People noticed small things they might have overlooked before: a creaking door, a warning call, or the quiet anxiety in someone's eyes. The tragedy had heightened a collective sense of vigilance. Memorials and annual gatherings became cornerstones of communal memory. Each year, townspeople gathered to honor the lost, not only to mourn, but also to celebrate the bravery and kindness that had emerged amidst the fear. Candles flickered, speeches were read, and moments of silence stretched long enough to remind everyone that life, despite its fragility, continued to carry meaning. Children learned early to respect the past, listening to stories not just of sorrow, but of courage and unity. Local authorities, having faced criticism in the immediate aftermath, worked to rebuild trust. Policies were revised, safety measures implemented, and emergency protocols are made transparent to all. The mayor, once visibly worn by the weight of responsibility, began to regain the confidence of his community. His speeches were now tinged not with helplessness, but with determination, encouraging citizens to engage in resilience building and preparation. The town, as a whole, developed a newfound sense of agency over their lives, knowing that while tragedy could strike without warning, they could respond with strength and cohesion. Psychologists and counselors continued to support survivors, teaching them coping strategies and ways to process lingering trauma. Community workshops and support groups flourished, providing spaces for dialogue, healing, and solidarity. These gatherings became not only therapeutic, but also unifying, knitting the town together with threads of shared experience and mutual care. People who once might have been strangers found themselves bound by empathy, each recognizing the vulnerability and resilience within the other. Even as time healed some wounds, subtle reminders of the incident persisted. Old houses bore scars, broken windows replaced, doors reforged, but memories etched into walls that no renovation could erase. The wind through narrow alleys sometimes carried echoes of hurried footsteps, laughter cut short, or distant cries. Survivors learned to coexist with these remnants, transforming fear into respect and pain into mindfulness. The past became a teacher, guiding future actions and fostering deeper compassion. In schools, children were taught the history of the event not as a tale of horror, but as a story of humanity's capacity to endure. Teachers emphasized lessons of courage, community responsibility, and empathy. Art and storytelling were encouraged, allowing young minds to process grief creatively. Through these acts, the town ensured that the memory of the incident would not breed despair, but a stronger or empathetic community. By the end of the year, the town had transformed subtly but significantly. People moved with intention, conversations carried weight, and acts of kindness became more deliberate. What once had been a community of routine and predictability was now a town bonded by shared experience, careful observation, and the unwavering knowledge that even in the darkest moments, human connection could endure. The tragedy, though never forgotten, had ultimately strengthened the threads of community, proving that resilience, courage, and compassion could emerge from even the most devastating events. As the town settled into a fragile rhythm, the memory of what had happened never truly left. Each street, each house, seemed to hold a quiet echo of that fateful day. Yet in those echoes lay not only sorrow, but also resilience, courage, and the unspoken bonds that tragedy had forged among the townspeople. It was in the small gestures, neighbors helping rebuild homes, children cautiously returning to playgrounds, families lighting candles in remembrance, that hope began to grow. The memorials became sacred. Flowers, flickering candles, and carefully inscribed names reminded everyone that loss was not to be forgotten. Survivors visited these sites often, sometimes alone, sometimes in quiet groups, reflecting on what had been lost and what had endured. Through grief, they learned the delicate balance between remembrance and moving forward, understanding that honoring the past did not mean surrendering to it. In stories emerged from the tragedy, stories of bravery, compassion, and human connection. A young boy, once frozen in fear, had helped his neighbor escape harm. A mother had shielded her children with unwavering determination. Even strangers, drawn together by circumstance, had shown courage that could not be measured in words. These acts became part of the town's collective memory, teaching lessons far beyond the immediate horror. Time continued to pass, but it did not erase the lessons learned. Children grew, carrying the memories of stories told at dinner tables and in classrooms. Schools incorporated these events into lessons of empathy, community, and responsibility. They emphasized that life's fragility demanded care, vigilance, and the courage to act when others needed help. The past became not just a cautionary tale, but also a guide, shaping the values and decisions of a new generation. Families rebuilt their homes and their routines. Streets were swept, doors repaired, windows replaced, yet the invisible marks remained. Each resident carried subtle reminders, hesitations, glances, a deeper appreciation for life's fleeting moments. Conversations became more intentional, actions more thoughtful, and kindness, once ordinary, now deliberate. The tragedy had reshaped the town, not by fear alone, but through a profound awakening of empathy and vigilance. No, even as normalcy returned, occasional tremors of anxiety reminded everyone that life could be unpredictable. A sudden noise, a shadow passing too quickly, could transport a survivor back to that day in an instant. Yet these moments, rather than paralyzing, became lessons in awareness and resilience. The town learned to coexist with its memories, using them as both a warning and a source of strength. For those watching this story unfold, the takeaway is clear: tragedy can strike without warning. But the human spirit is capable of enduring, adapting, and ultimately finding hope. Compassion, courage, and solidarity often emerge when they are needed most, illuminating the darkest moments. The town's journey reminds us all that while we cannot control every danger, we can control how we respond, through empathy, support, and the unwavering determination to persevere. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this: every act of kindness, every moment of courage, no matter how small, matters. Whether in your family, your community, or even in a stranger's life, your actions can leave lasting impact. Tragedy may mark our lives, but it does not define them. Our responses do. The power to heal, to help, and to remember lies within each of us. So, as you reflect on this story, think about those around you. Reach out to someone in need, lend a helping hand, or simply offer a listening ear. In doing so, you honor those who were lost, strengthen the bonds that tie communities together, and ensure that even in the face of darkness, hope continues to shine. Right? And if you want more real-life stories that reveal both the fragility and the resilience of life, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every story has lessons worth learning, moments worth remembering, and courage worth celebrating. Join us as we explore the depths of human experience, witness acts of bravery, and uncover the truths that shape our world.